Alright guys, so I am going to try to go through a bunch of stuff for week 15 here, so that we can officially sort of get through all the content for the class, which I know is kind of crazy, but I have a couple of more things to talk about in regards to conceptual art, as well as land art and performance art, and then I'll do like a brief synopsis of contemporary art as well. So we're going to start with conceptual art, as we talked about minimalism and process art. Minimalism in class, and talked about kind of the development of that. And so conceptual art is very much in the same vein of minimalism, but it takes it even to sort of the more further extreme. So even more dematerializing of the art object, the concept of art priority over actual media, artist as thinker versus object maker. It's critiquing the social position of the artist and challenges the passive viewer and museum as institution of social and economic power. The work is not necessarily there to satisfy the viewer, and in theory, the work couldn't be bought or sold in a commercially driven gallery system, even though that obviously kind of falls apart. So this is a quote about conceptualism, holds that the idea is the work of the art. Any painting, sculpture, drawing, print, photography, or building created in response to that idea is simply a piece of documentation, a record of aesthetic expression as opposed to aesthetic expression itself. I put this work, for example, up. This is Marcel Duchamp's work. I want to say it's, let's see here, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even. And this work was originally looked like this, and has been sort of recreated, but in its movement after being shown once in an exhibition ended up cracking quite drastically. And Duchamp repaired it, but he said that this actually was, actually added value and power to the work, stating, artists declared that the piece had not been destroyed, but rather completed by this accident, asserting the futility faced by an artist of trying to give form to an idea, so that this sort of happenstance actually added more to the work than he had originally anticipated. And reminds the artist that they're not sort of the only hand in creating art themselves. Here's Duchamp over here. Sol LeWitt is an artist who reflects on this as well, in his work. So Sol LeWitt is very interesting because a lot of his works kind of started out as these wall drawings. And what he would do was to create a sort of idea, concept, and map of this work. So not actually creating the sculpture itself, but just creating sort of the instructions for the work. And that these drawings would be sold to museums or gallery spaces or even put up as part of an exhibition, and they would be physically produced by someone else. According to LeWitt, it is his idea and written instructions that constitute the artwork, but there's all this participation as well. So the work itself is just about the conception, right? Sol LeWitt is sort of the impetus for creating the work. He's the artist, right? He's the designer, but he kind of takes the creation out of his hands in that the gallery space is allowed to kind of interpret it as they see fit. So you'll see sort of examples of the work then reproduced in sort of physical form in the museum structures. Kind of similar to Donald Judd and sort of using cubes and repetition. Joseph Kosuth is doing this as well with 1 and 3 chairs. This is all about sort of art and language in relation to kind of how signs are interpreted. For example, like Plato in his theory of forms talks about true form of something exists only in the idea of that thing. All representation of the idea are degraded versions. And so what Kossuth does is to give you sort of three examples of something that's considered a chair, right? The physical object itself, a photograph of the chair, and the definition of the chair. And then ask you to sort of think about which one is the actual chair, right? And then which is the artwork, right? Is the chair now a piece of art? Is the photograph, is the definition, right? And so he's playing with all these kind of concepts of language, of understanding of representation in museums, and what kind of constitutes chair at all, right? Robert Barry was another really famous conceptual artist. This is the work Inert Gas series from 1969. This work just lives in this photograph, and it was the releasing of 2 cubic feet of helium into an open space of the Mojave Desert and photographing this result. So again, this photograph is a documentation of this, but the art object, the art performance, is him literally releasing an invisible gas into a desert, right? So just thinking about the process and the idea of making this object and then photographing it and then saying this is the art that I produced out in the desert with gas and the earth, right? Robert Barry. Hans Hach is another very famous artist from this period as well, such as his condensation cube, in which he created a work just out of plexiglass and water, and it was just about sort of the process and physical system created within this box. So you have evaporation and then the condensation of water with the changing temperatures outside and inside the gallery, along with light, etc. And so it kind of changed freely, and it was about, again, about how objects could be bought and sold. Can you really sell a glass cube to a museum, and sort of how it condensates, right? Because this work is sort of existing as a living system within itself. Hans Hach was also very interesting because a lot of his work had to do with critiquing sort of different social institutions. So, for example, this is Sapolsky et al., Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, a real-time social system. And what he did was went around and chronicled slumlords over the course of 2 decades in New York City and took 146 photographs of Manhattan apartment buildings and charts that documented real estate transactions and texts and information about location and ownership, and really created this whole sort of installation in which he recorded all of these slumlords, right? And so this is not, again, about some kind of artistic object. It's about critiquing society in which objects and wealth and consumerism is sort of held at the highest priority, right? So in something like this, Hans Hach is critiquing the people of New York City, critiquing slumlords, and putting them on display, right? Calling them out for their sort of corruption. And he did this also continuously throughout his career. So this is Hans Hach, MoMA poll from 1970. And he created this work, but didn't tell MoMA what the question was going to be when the exhibition opened. And the question was, would the fact that Governor Rockefeller has not denounced President Nixon's Indochina policy be a reason for you not voting for him in November? And what this question is bringing up, which is not familiar to us necessarily if you don't know what was going on, but Rockefeller was considering for running for president at the time, and he was supporting the Vietnam War, and he was on the board at MoMA, and so had control of the finances and whatnot. And so Hans Hach directly called him out as a financier of the museum, as a supporter of the museum, called out the museum itself for supporting someone who supported the Vietnam War, which was not popular, and thus created work that was about how museum culture is run, and then how you then feel about sort of what goes on behind the scenes, right? And so what happened, of course, was that people voted, and there were twice as many yes votes as there were no votes, right? So sort of showing that people very much connected with this question, right? They were asked this very specific question about how they would feel, and they responded, right? In that they felt that it was concerning to them that he was on the board at MoMA, and that he was supporting the Vietnam War. And of course, he wasn't elected, as we sort of all know, hopefully.
So this really develops this kind of idea, artist as thinker versus artist as object maker. So instead of thinking about an artist as someone who produces a painting, produces a sculpture, it is instead about an artist who thinks, contemplates, questions society. And
Here's another example of kind of a more contemporary version of this voting system, as well as the ballot for voting. So this really falls in line with the development of institutional critique, in thinking about sort of critiquing museums and kind of questioning their narratives as a whole. So Daniel Buren is at the forefront of this and sort of this controversy in his painting sculpture, which was this sort of large canvas that hung in the middle of the Guggenheim. And in this exhibition, multiple artists were displaying their work there, and he created this in like another banner outside, I believe. And what ended up happening was all the artists sort of came together and said that they did not want his work in the Guggenheim because it was blocking the view of their own work, which is a little ironic, but also he was trying to kind of engage with this visuality of like changing the way you engage with the space. And so what ended up happening was they removed the work from the museum. And it became this big controversy about what sort of, about censorship and what shouldn't be allowed to happen, and then having artists kind of censor them each other, and then the institution sort of going along with it as well. So really questioning kind of what is the museum doing, what kind of power do they have in sort of telling particular narratives or ideas. So you have that kind of existing, and I would go into more depth if we had time, but a lot of it revolves around different constructs of artists kind of critiquing directly or indirectly museums. So here you have Marcel Brothers doing this with Museum from 1972, in which he kind of made these stage performances and sort of fake museums, and then had them kind of like making playful commentary about it. So like he made this fictitious museum, he put fictitious objects in it, and then even like built the museum on this like beach. So he really was commenting on sort of commercialism and capitalism, and playing with like kind of just joking about sort of museum structures as a whole and kind of what value they hold. He had people wearing museum hats, and he and colleagues set up signs warning visitors not to touch the objects, and then eventually sort of the tide came in and washed away the whole museum entirely. Andrea Frazier is a big participant in discussing sort of institutional critique. She writes a lot of the big articles on this subject matter. She has done a lot of performances as well. And you can look into them if you want. One of them includes sort of her, like having sex with like a collector as part of a work of art, and talking about how her art is her selling herself. And so she's like prostitutes herself out for this work, which I do not remember what it's called offhand. But this is Museum Highlights. And it's where she goes into this museum space and kind of poses as this fake docent. And she goes around and leads all these kind of tours and introduces all these sort of comedic elements of the museum. So she talks about the exit signs, she talks about the donors, she talks about the bubblers, etc. So it kind of refers to different elements in the museum that aren't really part of the art, right, technically, and then also discuss corporate and private censorship, and lack of museum representation, and this then, of course, leads to sort of figures, and you can think about like any figure in institutional critique, like the Guerrilla Girls, or other groups sort of engaging in the same dialogue at the time. Process art comes very much as part of conceptual art as well, and more specifically kind of addressing the process of creation. So we're starting to call these post-minimalists, right, because we're moving into more contemporary art. But again, the process of making art versus the actual object itself focus as much on the means and duration of the product as on the final product, like scatterworks, raw materials dispersed all over the floor. Eva Hesse is definitely a really good example of process art. Because she was playing with unconventional materials like latex, rubber tubing, fiberglass, and playing with a lot of these objects that wouldn't last. So this is rope piece, and it is made of latex over ropes with string and wire, and is really about the process of making and hanging it in the museum structure itself. It's held up by 13 different points, but those points can be kind of arranged in any way you so choose. So it couldn't be kind of perfectly represented in any other space. It's also quite fragile. Now that the latex is kind of dried, it chips off. And it's interesting to see kind of this museum, I think it's at the Whitney right now, kind of move these objects around and to play with this idea of changing the way that the sculpture looks. And I'm going to show you this video here that kind of shows that, just so you get an idea of how this piece looks, because it's kind of hard to think to process visually, since it's not all that like sort of satisfying visually necessarily.
This is a piece that has variously been called rope piece and a number of other things, but it really has no title. It's often referred to as rope piece. It's one of the last pieces that Eva Hesse made before she died. In fact, she never had a chance to install it. It had only ever been hung in her studio, had never actually been installed in an exhibition. The idea was to create a piece that was malleable in the process of making it so that it completes itself. And she talked about making a work that could kind of find its own form. The piece is never installed the same way twice.
So there's actually like about 13 hanging points on the piece, and over the years we've changed the way we've installed it.
When we hang it, we're working off of a template that has a rough placement for each of the points where it attaches either to the ceiling or to the wall. But there's certain places where you make choices. As the years go on, the latex, which started to harden basically as soon as she made it, has become even more brittle. So we built these incredibly detailed crates that try to mimic as best as they can the configuration when they're hung. So the difference between when they're in the crate and hanging on the wall is as minimal as possible. We've experimented over the years with, sort of expanding it and having a more lyrical, open installation or making it a little bit more compressed. But I think that's the beauty of the piece. That's the magic of it, that you can't ever repeat yourself, even if you tried. So the work has sort of, a mind of its own. And as she says, its own order, its own structure is chaos.
So you can see that piece here in her studio. So again, she wasn't able to, she died at 34, I believe, of a type of cancer, if I'm not mistaken, but this work was never hung in a museum space, but then was taken out of her studio and hung. So in reality, no one ever really knew how it was supposed to be hung up in this space. Another work of hers, this is Sands number 2. This will kind of show you what some of the deterioration of these works looks like, because a lot of them, because of this latex and polyester resin, are falling apart easily. And so people kind of talk about restoration when it comes to her work. Do you protect it? Do you save it? Or do you let it deteriorate? Because a lot of her work is about the process versus for the final object itself. And so there's been a lot of conversation amongst museums about that. And you can see in this work some bit of deterioration. So for this work, for example, that I forgot to put in the presentation, apparently, which is that instead of sort of trying to restore this work as it's kind of deteriorated, they have recreated what it would have looked like originally, and kind of preserved it in this format to kind of show what the original look of the work was. They've had to kind of deal with this with other works as well. For example, with something like Expanded Expansion, where she's usually using cheesecloth, which also does not last very well. You can see the kind of drastic deterioration of this work and the kind of hardness and dryness of the surfaces that has sort of existed and started to wear and tear on the work. And it's hard for museums because obviously they cost money, they're their investment, but the objects were really never meant to last.
You can also think about Richard Long. They mentioned a different work in the book. This is sort of his original line, Made by Walking, in which he walked back and forth across a field with, I believe, he had a stick, and he rubbed the ground in the same place over and over, walking back and forth, and created this line, right? And the line became the work itself, about the process of him walking back and forth, and then recording it in photography. This sort of is the documentation that it existed. The work is this physical interaction he had with the landscape itself, of literally sort of etching that line into the ground. So very much sort of playing with time and movement in place in process art. Now, all of this art, this type of work, process art, really leads us into land art. You can also talk about it as earthworks or earth art, and then we're going to talk about site art as well. So really examining the relationship with land and nature, very much kind of in this context of Richard Long, and a lot of it does have to do with the process versus the actual finished product of the work itself. Now, the reason that this work became so popular in the 60s and 70s, artists really wanted to contemplate the intersection of architecture and sculpture, as well as site-specific work, natural and organic materials, including the land itself. Form varied, it could be destructive, ritualistic, conceptual, ephemeral, and documentation through photography. So the only way that you could see that this work was created or know that the artist created it was because they would document it with photography, because some of them were ephemeral, meaning that they were very, very temporary. Why did they create this work? There was this widespread concern about pollution, the depletion of natural resources, and toxic waste because of widespread industrialization, and it brought a lot of environmental issues to national attention, as well as dialogue. There was the Santa Barbara oil spill, which is photographed here at the bottom, in 1969, and it was one of the biggest spills at the time, from about 80,000 to 10 or 100,000 barrels of oil spilled off of South Carolina, and killing about 3,500 sea creatures and species. So it really made people start to question sort of our interaction with the land and sort of what that meant, artistically or otherwise. So there was also the development of big policies because of this oil spill, like the National Environment Policy Act in '69, as well as different assessments and statements. That really was a big part of people starting to investigate nature and process art on the land as well. And we'll see sort of how spectator participation as well as institutional critique come in. The works themselves often exist and are sort of can't be separated from the viewer themselves, as well as sort of critiquing institutions by creating art that is outside the museum space. They are thus creating works that critique the institution, and these works can't be sort of commodified in the same way as a painting or a sculpture.
A lot of this focus on the environment also comes out of specific events, including the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969. And it was really part of this larger conversation about pollution and the depletion of natural resources. And it kind of brought a lot of these issues to the national dialogue, hence why land art and earthworks become sort of inherently important. And this was one of the biggest oil spills of that time, 80 to 100,000 barrels of crude oil spilled off the channel of South California. And it estimated to have killed 3,500 seabirds, as well as dolphins, elephants, seals, and sea lions. And so it was just kind of catastrophic. And so people were really starting to have conversations about the environment and explosions of particular oil spills and oil rigs, because it was a particular rig here, this rig here that kind of exploded. So it wasn't necessarily sort of any particular, like no one dumped it on purpose, but there was this sort of explosion that allowed all of this oil to kind of seep into the ocean.
Michael Heiser is a really important practitioner of land art and earthwork, really sort of one of the founders and developers. And he was really influenced by his archaeologist family and really worked to sort of develop and think about art outside of the museum space. So one of his most famous works is Double Negative from 67 to 70. And he was spending time in the Nevada desert, and he found a place, as the book calls it, that kind of unraped, peaceful, religious space artists have always tried to put in their works, which is weird. But he wanted to talk about vastness and void, and so he, with his team, created these two cuts in the land. And here the viewer is sort of confronted with this weird sort of cut in the landscape. And he cut it across this canyon here, and canyon, and that you could sort of walk in it and experience it. So you kind of see it, you kind of connect with it, but at the same time you don't see the thing as a whole, right? You're kind of inside, experience it from outside. So he really wanted to think about the space, the desert as a space. It's also a place people do not go. I don't think it's a highly visited earth art or piece of land art, but he sort of literally created it in this kind of unknown vast landscape to try to talk about space itself, or the lack of space or lack of object in that space. So literally sort of carving away the land. What I like about this work on his website is that you can kind of look at it and see, you don't have to sort of go to this work to be able to look at it. You can kind of look at it from his website, which I included in my links as well. So kind of an interactive look at this work. And you can imagine people sort of walking around in these deep cuts in the Nevada desert. He's also well known for Levitated Mass, which is owned by LACMA, that he created in 2012, in which he transported a 340-ton boulder, which was placed over a pathway to allow people to view it from sort of all angles. It's very interesting. Walter de Maria worked with Michael Heiser on some works as well, creating his most famous work, Lightning Field, another work in the desert in New Mexico, in which he placed 400 precision poles on a large grid in the desert, in which it would sort of conjure and connect with lightning storms. So you can go and see this work and stay on the property and see sort of interestingly how this work kind of connects with the environment and is kept up by the Dia Foundation. But it's also about the connection with nature and bringing down lightning so that people can sort of connect with it and think about sort of the power of nature. You can think about, like, I always think about that Sweet Home Alabama scene where they make glass in the sand or whatever, right? Connecting with the lightning. Other works like Nancy's Hold Sun Tunnels is another work supported by the Dia Foundation, in which 4 concrete cylinders are 18 feet in length, and they are arranged in a format to frame the sun on the horizon during the summer and winter solstice. So very different from other works in that she's placing these objects in the land again, and really making people think about the rising and the setting of the sun and the connection with this sort of passage of time. I do have a video on the links in which you can watch time lapse. You can see how the sun is framed in these tunnels. It's really quite gorgeous. Another artist that I usually have students connect with a lot because of his documentary Rivers and Tides gives you a really good sense of what land art and earth art is as a whole. He really creates very ephemeral works in which he often just creates the work in a forest and it's gone almost immediately. So like using leaves and trying to make sort of color, ombre effects into these voids or around trees themselves. And a lot of the objects last for a very short amount of time and thus don't exist unless Goldsworthy himself photographs them. He does have some works in museums and such, but I don't think they're nearly as powerful as the land work art. The reason I usually have my students watch his documentary is because you really see how an artist connects with land art and earthworks. He talks about his need and connection for the land, the power that he feels from it, but also sort of the negatives and positives, right? Mother Earth doesn't really care what he does. It doesn't care if it's destroyed. There's this work that he builds in this documentary where he literally builds this out of icicles that he hands, if you watch it, to construct this ice sculpture that you can see his breath. It's obviously freezing out, to create these moments that last so briefly, but are really just so insanely gorgeous. Robert Smithson is another really important land art and earth art artist. Probably his most well-known work is Spiral Jetty, which I'm going to talk about here shortly. But he's also known for non-sites, which is a very interesting set of works that are kind of land art and earthworks, but within a museum space. So he would collect rocks and minerals and earth from specific sites and place them in crates and spaces in a museum and sort of frame the actual site as a collection. It became this really weird kind of new sculpture in which he would take a piece of landscape, right, and actually put it in a museum. So taking something like this, like rocks from a space, talking about it, documenting it, and then bringing it into the museum gallery itself. So really breaking down a space to its sort of material components, right? Sort of quote unquote non-sites. Spiral Jetty is definitely his most famous work, the one that everybody sort of knows him for. He saw mining equipment that had been left behind when a company failed to extract oil from this site and really felt a connection with the environment's ability to endure. And so he decided to sort of construct this earthwork here. And he was really inspired by the salt. This is in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. The salt structures that had these kind of spiral components, thus creating Spiral Jetty. So he used sort of construction equipment to build this. He moved something like 1,500, let's see, 6,000 tons of basalt rock to build it. So took the earth itself and built this structure. It was about 1,500 feet long and 15 feet wide, and really was kind of inspired to create this work because of this material as well as this salt as well. He was also kind of interested in the blood red color of the water because of the red hue of the bacteria in the water. It would create this kind of weird color that Smithson connected with the quote-unquote primordial sea and the past, connecting the past history of the earth with the present history of the earth, as well as, again, the salt here. And it's very interesting to see the salt build up on the structure that sort of becomes a different component of the sculpture itself. Now, this work can be visited by people. It's quite hard to trek to. From what I've heard, I have not seen it. I have a friend who broke her leg trying to visit it. She did visit it, but she did break her leg on the way there. But it is hard to sort of get to and is out kind of in the middle of nowhere in Utah. But people can go there and walk around it and sort of this connection with moving around this structure in time. And sometimes it is submerged in the sea itself. Or the lake, I'm sorry. And so people can kind of walk on it, but it's also kind of sinks into the ground. So it's very interesting to think about how the earth kind of takes back this structure, sends it back, takes it back over time. Now, site-specific art is kind of a part of earth art and land art. It very much connects to this idea, and to site-specific art. So in the 1960s, there was a critique of modern sculpture and arts. Modern art objects were transportable and could exist in museum space, thus making them objects of commodification. Addressed critically the context and content of site. Artists made a work of art for a specific space. If removed from that space, then the work was destroyed. So artists creating works for specific places, so that theoretically the work couldn't be commodified by a museum structure. Now, the book kind of places Christo and Jean-Claude in site-specific art. I also kind of think that they're land artists as well. I think they also might have called them conceptual artists, which I think I wouldn't agree with. So we're going to categorize Christo and Jean-Claude within land art, in earth art, or in site-specific art as sort of a subcategory. And Christo and Jean-Claude are a married couple artistic group, and Christo escaped the Soviet Union and met his wife, and they are both born on the same day, in June 13th of 1935, and they saw themselves as kind of an inseparable pair, and they would even fly in separate planes to different locations for their work because they were concerned that if one of them died, the other person could still carry on their work, which is very interesting. So other famous works by them include Running Friends. This was a famous work that they did in which it stretched over quite a bit of land, where they wanted to talk about sort of altering the physical landscape, allowing viewers to perceive and understand location with new appreciation. For this project, they had to enlist 59. Did I just do that again? I am so slip of the hand today. I do not know. 1 second. They had to get 59 families of ranchers to be convinced and to create this structure, and then they had a lot of different volunteers. They always sort of raised their own finances for their work to create this structure that really rethought this space, that moved throughout here, and you could see that it eventually ended in the sea. So really reconstructing and rethinking the space by creating this long sort of gorgeous nylon fence in the center. And this is sort of site-specific to this landscape, right? To the borders of the ranches, to these individual families who they asked permission to create this work. Other works of theirs include The Gates in Central Park. I include this one because I believe it's pretty famous and well known, that they created this space within New York City, and it's really pretty gorgeous. The way that you see sort of these fences contrast with the whiteness of the landscape. It's such a different sort of look and brings attention to sort of this space in general. And even when you see it here in the snow, it's just breathtaking. So performance art, and where we get the development of performance theory, really begins in the 60s and 70s. We have Dada being a big part of that, that we saw. Situationalist, Fluxus, installation art, conceptual art. We have the challenging of theater. It's interdisciplinary, something that can't be purchased and different every time. Artists, again, are still dealing with this idea and trying to rethink it. And we'll see that in performances, but museums have easily adapted to this and purchased performances, if you can believe that. This includes elements such as time, space, performer's body, and the relationship between performer and audience. I think some of the most, where you kind of see the beginning of performance art, quote-unquote performance art of the 60s and 70s really happens with Alan Capro and his work. It's really kind of where we talk about some of the start to the idea of performance art. Happening, as Alan Capro described it, is something spontaneous, something that just happens to happen, and he staged this in a gallery space. So he created this kind of weird interactive space where all of these rooms were divided, and made sort of into different sort of sections of this performance. You would have a room where actors entered and exited, and these kind of fragmented events. And a lot of them was kind of art of the everyday and everyday tasks or events. And it was really about sort of kind of just having a place where people participated, and how it was something, right, completely couldn't be commodified, couldn't be remade, because although actors had scripts, right, they're all kind of, each performance is kind of unique in its own capacity, and these people would just kind of enact everyday things, like painting or playing instruments or whatever. I have a description here. Lasting for 90 minutes, the 18 simultaneous performances included painters painting a canvases, procession of performers, readings from place cards, or placards, the playing of musical instruments, and ended with 2 performers saying single-syllable words like but and well, as 4 huge scrolls fell from the horizontal bar between them. The end of the event was signaled by a bell ringing twice. So while it feels like this work kind of has no social theme or purpose, it's really about just kind of reinventing the idea of art and performance. So Alan Capro did a lot of this, like with his work Yard, in which it was an exhibition space where people would just kind of come and play with tires. Other works included Fluids. He posted this poster called Fluids, a happening by Alan Capro, in which it read, during 3 days, about 20 rectangular excuse me, enclosures of ice blocks measuring about 30 feet wide, 30 feet long, 10 wide, and 8 high are built throughout the city. Their walls are unbroken. They are left to melt. And he got volunteers from different colleges to come and create these works. And they would spend the whole day building these really massive ice sculptures and just leave them to melt, right? I mean, they couldn't exist outside of that. And so it was just about the process and the literal creation and the bringing of people together that made this work important and valuable. So there's a recreation from 2005. As I said before, we were going to come back to Yves Klein in his work Leap into the Void. And this was an interesting work. He wanted to show the practical demonstration of levitation and sort of dealing with again, performances and interactions. And so he left from this building, but then had this photo edited to remove the trampoline where people are waiting to catch him. But he was very interested in this sort of performance actions as well. I'll tell you about an artist who did this better than Klein. But he really worked on this very important series of works called anthropometries. I don't know why I can't say that word. Of the Blue Period from 1960. In which he created this series of works in which he would use females as what he called living brushes and would put on this pure color, right, this international blue color that he invented. And he would direct the individuals to cover themselves in paint and then press their bodies up against these pieces of paper, thus creating these silhouettes. The symphony plays, and it's about this kind of chance and spontaneity and the performance as a whole, and sort of with then the creation of the work at the end of it. And here is it. Now, I would suggest watching this video because you kind of get the sense of my distaste for Klein, in that although people have talked about how, oh, he was so nice to these women and they were a part of the exhibition, calling women living brushes and utilizing them as paintbrushes on a canvas in kind of this exploitative way is really not at the core of performance art, sort of in any capacity, and also really undermines women in the artistic community as sort of, again, objects to be displayed and utilized for your end product. So I'm not the biggest fan of Yves Klein. It's really weird to watch. I would definitely suggest taking a look at it because it's just like the weirdest thing.
I wanted to show you a couple more images of how this process kind of appears on canvas after being created. And I think that when you see sort of the way the body is being manipulated of these women, you get the sense of how kind of sort of objectifying it is. And I'll show you here because I feel like... Oh, here's the audience at the performance. The way in which Klein kind of participates in the manipulation of the body. So as the women kind of lay down and he kind of presses them with both hands and kind of manipulates the body so that you get sort of a full encompassing imprint, it feels sort of very overtly sexualized and graphic because he's kind of manipulating these bodies in this sort of very objectifyingly specific way. So I wanted to show you these images to give you a sense of that. Like this one in particular feels sort of very directly objectifying of women's bodies. As a side note to kind of the opposite version of Yves Klein and kind of someone who's kind of participating in similar ideas without kind of doing it in an objectifying way, is Teichin Hsieh. And he was born in Taiwan and started performing actions. He, much like Klein, jumped out of a window. And in actuality, so Klein claims that he climbed out a window. He likely did not. Hsieh actually did, in fact, do this out of a second-story floor onto concrete, which shocked the local community, and he ended up breaking both of his ankles. But really was about sort of how much he could push the limits of his body, and he's done this quite frequently in the work itself. So he moved to New York City very shortly after this work and started creating other sort of durational performances, many of them 1 year in length. So for example, this one being where he locked himself in a cell and he was not allowed to read, talk, write, listen to radio or TV, etc. And he just had to sit and be with his thoughts for an entire year. And he had someone who came and delivered food, removed waste, would take a photograph, and then would leave. And people could come and visit sort of like twice a month. Living art piece is another one. He usually did work alone, but in this one he was tied to another woman, his friend Linda Montano, and they had to stay sort of tied together the entire time. It was about 8 feet of slack between them. So he does this with living outside in New York, not creating art for a year, so he kind of engages with a lot of different narratives surrounding this idea as a whole. But his work is really powerful and very much sort of a I would say like a foil to Klein's work as a whole.
We also had artists literally making themselves sort of into living sculptures with Gilbert and George in some of their works. They created their sort of live body as the object itself. They made works such as Underneath the Arches, in which they kind of made themselves into what kind of looks like robotic sculptures. And they would paint their faces gold and their suits, and they would move in this mechanical way. And it was supposed to collapse the idea between the artist and the art, and the live body as the art object, traditionally talking about forms, again, of art. This is an object, unlike a sculpture, that can't be purchased. And they sang this song about homelessness and hope during the Great Depression. So I would definitely suggest watching this video of them singing, because it's really strange and gives you kind of a feeling about like when you go and see robotic bodies singing in a museum. Joseph Boyce is a really out there performance artist. He had kind of a weird life in dealing with sort of his life after World War II and work fighting in World War II, and a lot of his works involve sort of ritual and transformation, and thinking about sort of changing your consciousness and your ideas. This is his work, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare, which is about what it sounds like. He covered his face in honey and gold leaf. He held a hare and carried it around this exhibition, and he would whisper things into the hare's ears and touch the paws of the dead animal to different works, and I would try to explain them to him. And all the while the gallery viewers stood outside of the exhibition and watched him kind of do this, he was kind of talking about this mystery and ritual between animal and human forms. He also was thinking about himself as a shaman, but he did some interesting things like debilitating himself, and he strapped this big metal piece to his foot, along with having this weird golden face. Here's a description for you. At the beginning of the performance, Boyce locked the gallery doors from the inside, leaving the gallery goers outside. They could observe the scene within only through the windows. With his head entirely coated in honey and gold leaf, he began to explain pictures to a dead hare, whispering to the dead animal on his arm in an apparent dialogue. He processed through the exhibit from artwork to artwork. Occasionally he would stop and return to the center of the gallery, where he stepped over a dead fir tree that lay on the floor. After 3 hours, the public was let into the room. Boyce sat up in the stool in the entrance area with the hare on his arm and his back to the onlookers. Boyce has commented on his use of a hare, and sort of his connection with animals and dead animals. He said the hare has a strong affinity to women, to birth and to menstruation, and generally to chemical transformation of the blood. That's what the hare demonstrates to us all when he hollows out this form, the movement of incarnation. The hare incarnates himself into the earth, which is what we human beings can only radically achieve with our thinking. He rubs, pushes, and digs himself into materia. Earth finally penetrates its laws. Through this work, his thinking is sharpened, then transforms and becomes revolutionary. Even a dead animal, Boyce mused in a statement on his action, preserves more powers of intuition than some human beings with their stubborn rationality. Ouch. Human thinking was capable of achieving so much, but it could also be intellectualized to a deadly degree and remain dead, and express its deadliness in political and pedagogical fields. So he's very much kind of dealing with all these ideas of ritual and animal consciousness and overall sort of a weird and complicated performance. Another one of his works that he did, he flew into the United States in his work I Like America and America Likes Me, in which he shared a space with a wild coyote for 7 days, and he wanted to reflect on the American Indian, aka a Native American, persecution. He wanted to see nothing inside the United States. So instead, he was kind of like, he flew to New York. He was picked up in an ambulance and swathed in felt, which you can see here, and taken to the Wren Block Gallery. And then he lived with this wild coyote for 8 hours a day for the next 3 days until, interestingly enough, the coyote and him kind of became friends and connected to each other in this symbolic way. And then at the end of the 3 days, he was transported back and never saw a piece of American soil. So wanted to talk about the connection between Native Americans in the land and how they're sort of pulled away from this space, and also sort of commenting on their persecution, while also dealing with some interesting ideas of animals and space as well. Now, as a subsection of performance art, we have body art. And this is where you get some of the really complex conversation about social critique. And really sort of powerful because the artist is taking their own body and using it as a subject or object of the work. It's very unflinchingly real. It usually uses their body in sort of dramatic and painful ways to sort of push them to the limit of what their flesh can experience. And so they're sort of forced to witness private violent acts against one's own body. So I do have this warning in here. There are no artists that are raped in this work, but they're definitely dealing with some of these constructs and ideas, so I want you to be aware of it, especially when we start getting into conversations about women and women's bodies. We're going to start out talking about men's, which mostly is just violent in some capacities, but I just wanted to warn you that some of them are a little tricky to comprehend and also sort of deal with if you have sort of triggering reasons why these subjects, if they bother you in any way. So just do your best with it, and let me know if you have any problems or anything. But leading into body art, we have Chris Burden, and he's a really powerful and interesting body artist, because he really provoked kind of, I would say, most violent figure against his own body in this type of art. For example, in Shoot in 1971, Burden wanted to provoke ideas about how the Vietnam War and television violence had kind of made people desensitized to pain, and so he dealt with this in a lot of his works. So Shoot, for example, in which he had a friend shoot him in the arm, and it just grazed his arm, and he wanted to talk about these ideas of violence in cinema, as well as sort of some sadistic ideas. I do have the video of this one, which is very short and not graphic at all, because it happens very quickly. But then it didn't hurt him very much to have grazed his arm, but then he had to go and explain it to a hospital, which is kind of funny, and explain how he asked someone to shoot him in the arm for artistic reasons. But a lot of his other work, like Transfixed, he nailed himself to a Volkswagen Beetle, talking about ritualistic connections with his body, as well as the violence with the Vietnam War as well. In doing this is very sort of intense and violent. And here are the nails that he used, kind of a relic of this work. Vito Conchi is another one of those artists that really pushes his body and his practice to really limits of violence and exploitation. He really believed that a lot of viewers were kind of passive viewers to art. They really had no connection and no interaction, and he wanted to change that. So in works like Trademarks, he created these performances where he literally bit himself as hard as he could on different parts of his body, and then used printer's ink to make imprints of them, literalizing the idea of artist as maker, but also trying to make things that can't necessarily be bought and sold. He also did works like Following Piece, in which he followed people randomly around New York City. He could choose anybody, and he could follow them until they entered a building, and sometimes they would last a few minutes, other times a few hours, and he would move all around New York, sort of having a conversation between the artist and the viewer, right? You have this sort of weird stalkery connection as an artist kind of follows someone around and goes into their private space, right? But it also puts control into the viewer's hands, even though they don't know they have it, because they would lead him into wherever they would go, he would go. Now, probably one of his most controversial pieces was Seedbed from 1972, and this was a really strange work, in which we had the gallery space here on the left that the viewer would come in and walk through, and it didn't have any space in it, and all the viewer could sort of hear was sounds, and sort of random words and language, and didn't really know what was going on. And later on, it was revealed that Vito Conchi was underneath this, so they built up the gallery into this space so that Vito Conchi could be underneath it, and he had a screen where he would watch the different figures, and he would masturbate to the individuals in the gallery, and he would narrate what he was thinking out loud to them, which was then projected into the gallery space. So, as you can imagine, this was super controversial, super crazy. It was about trust and violation, what was sexual, what was ethical, the public versus private, right? You're kind of, he was kind of interjecting himself into this personal space of people and kind of sexually abusing them in sort of a verbal way, and then masturbating to them. I mean, if you had done this straight to someone's face, can you imagine, right? But kind of about this intimate connection between the visitor and the artist. Neither of them had personal sort of connection with one another, physical, but very sort of graphic in the way that the artist kind of used his power to sort of sexually invade their space. Now, with artists, with female artists, I feel like performance art kind of went in a very different direction. I really have some familiarity with Yoko Ono because of her connection with John Lennon, but she was a performance artist and sort of general artist before they ever sort of met. And she was living in Tokyo when the bombs were dropped by American forces in '45 and really wanted to sort of deal with some of these complex ideas about individual personality and the connection between artist and viewer. And one of her most famous pieces is Cut Piece. And in this work, Yoko Ono sat on the stage and people were invited to come and cut pieces of her clothing off and could leave and keep it. And some people would come and cut very small pieces away from her clothing, while others would cut away her bra straps and shirt. And it was about sort of audience participation and what it kind of means when you bring an audience group together. And what they're sort of capable of doing. And I do have the video of this one because as you watch it, goodness gracious, you get sort of how at first it seems kind of playful and sweet. People are cutting off very small portions of the clothing, being very respectful. And you have a young man come up, and it seems like he's kind of egged on by the audience, and he cuts off quite a bit of her clothing, revealing her bra, cutting off her bra straps, and sort of creating this kind of sexual assault of her in some capacity. And although Yoko Ono was allowed to stop the piece at any time, she really wanted to push the limits of what people were capable of doing. And we'll see this even more with Marina Abramovic, but it showed that when sort of left to their own devices, people were willing to kind of exploit women and exploit this situation where they could kind of take advantage of her as an artist. Very sort of powerful statement for the time. She is really well known for other works like Grapefruit. This is a really fun book that Yoko Ono produced from '64, in which she created all these different little, like, it kind of reminds me of like process or conceptual art, in which she created these kind of different things that you could do and participate in as little performances of your own. And then at the end of the book, it says for you to burn it, which I do not plan on doing with my print. But this is one of my favorites. Hide and seek piece. Hide until everybody goes home. Hide until everybody forgets about you. Hide until everybody dies. From 1964 spring. So really kind of playing with this idea of conceptual art. Other important female artists, Carolee Schneemann. She did a lot of different work. She was really one of the founders of performance art, her and Marina Abramovic, and playing with the female body. This is I Body, in which she played with herself as a human canvas, kind of merging herself with paint and glue, fur, feathers, garden snakes, glass, and plastic, and exploring the idea of flesh as material while her friend photographed her, as well as the connection between female as figure in painting, as content in painting. But her most famous work is Interior Scroll. She created this work in which she entered the room in a robe and apron with 2 sheets, disrobed and stood like being drawn, and then held a sheet around her. She read from her book Cezanne. She was a great painter. She dropped the sheet, retained the apron, and began to apply strokes of dark paint to her face and body. And then, as sort of the performance moved on, she finally removed a scroll from her vagina, and she read from it, which is a work that she wrote called Kitch's Last Meal, which I will post the text on Canvas so you can read it. But it recounts a conversation with a structuralist filmmaker who she was possibly dating, in which a male talks about what females and males should do. And so it became this sort of interesting, introspective work where she's talking about her vagina as sort of a physical, conceptually, a source of sacred knowledge and ecstasy, but also about kind of talking about the suppressive history of women, of orgasmic pleasure, of birth, of transformation, of menstruation, of maternity, and also these constructs of what women should and shouldn't do, right? And sort of literally pulling this scroll on a vagina and reading from it. So she kind of read from it as she pulled it out, was supposed to be this kind of insanely shocking moment for the members of the audience. And it was about these historic ideas of what women should and shouldn't do, and she wanted to kind of throw them all away and make them invaluable and unimportant, and really insanely shocked the viewers of her work with this. Here's the actual scroll now, stained kind of weirdly. As I said, Marina Abramovic is another one of those figures who's really kind of considered one of the founders of performance art with her work. Our book talks about her in the context of Abramovic in Oulé, which is really strange because nobody really... I wouldn't say that Oulé is much as a household name as Marina Abramovic, and not separating them, I feel like, is at the core the problem and the issue that performance art is trying to remind us, that women and their bodies are just as important as males and their bodies, but nonetheless. The reason that they mention them together is that Abramovic and Oulé really worked as a performance duo for a long time, and he'll come up again, but they created works like Imponderablia and a Biblia from 77, in which they stood naked in a gallery space, and people had to literally walk through the two of them naked to get to the other side of the gallery as the entranceway. So trying to kind of make people uncomfortable and talk about these ideas of the female body and the male body and sort of who they faced as they went in, the male or the female, right, of kind of determined their comfort level with the situation. But Abramovic is really known for her rhythm series. She did a number of them. We're going to talk about 10, 5, and 0, in which she created these really graphic performances with her own body. So she wanted to know how sort of far she could push her physical body and pain, and really kind of stretch the viewer as well. So this work in particular, she moved during this performance, she was recording herself, and she would take a knife, you can see all these knives lined up, and she would poke them in between her fingers, each one of them, and sometimes she would hit the side of her finger, and sometimes she wouldn't, and she would go through each knife and do this, and then in the second iteration of this, she would play back this sound of her doing it the first time, and she would try to make it exactly the same. So that meant cutting herself in the same place as before, trying to do it on purpose, right? So trying to recreate the first performance. So again, it's kind of mind over matter in that she literally had to stab herself, cut herself in this action. Other works involved her in Rhythm 5, in which she set this star on fire and threw her hair and like toenails into, and then she ended up laying in the middle of it and passed out, and people had to actually drag her body out because people were afraid that she was harming herself. But the most sort of well-known and infamous work that very much connects with Yoko Ono's work is Rhythm 0. This work, she brought people together in a gallery space, and she laid out this table. And on the table it said, instructions. There are 72 objects on the table that one can use on me as desired. Performance. I am the object. During this period, I take full responsibility. Duration, 6 hours. And so in doing this, she had objects like a rose, a feather, perfume, honey, bread, grapes, wine, scissors, scalpel, nails, metal bar, and a gun loaded with 1 bullet. And after the instructions were given, people could do whatever they wanted to her physical body. And it kind of started out fine, but by the 3rd hour, people were cutting her skin. They held the gun to her head. They cut off her clothes. There were different factions of people who were sexually assaulting her, and they were cutting her with the thorns from the roses, and other people who were trying to stop this from occurring, and it created this great friction. I have this description by an art critic. It began tamely. Someone turned her around, someone thrust her arms into the air. The Neapolitan night began to heat up. The third hour, all of her clothes were cut from her with razor blades. In the fourth hour, the same blades began to expose her skin. Her throat was slashed so someone could suck her blood. Various minor sexual assaults were carried out on her body. She was committed to the piece that she would not have resisted rape or murder. Faced with her own abdication of will, with its implied collapse of human psychology, a protective group began to define itself in the audience. When a loaded gun as thrust at Marina's head and her own finger was being worked around the trigger, a fight broke out between audience factions. And so as this work progressed, it really became a conversation about when people are left to their own devices, are they willing to take advantage? Are they willing to sexual assault this women? And they did. They went to the extreme, right? It wasn't that these people were going to be tame and interact appropriately. It became negative. It became assaultive. And it pushed the limits of who she was as an individual and what she could sort of withstand. And she cried during this performance, and at the end, when she stood up to leave, people ran. They thought they were going to be arrested because they had sexually assaulted this woman, and of course nothing happened, but it was really about sort of her connection with the audience members and what the audience members were willing to do if she took the responsibility off of them, and as a female, allowing people, if given the opportunity, that they would sexually assault her. Now, her works have become tamer over the years. That's quite a graphic work, quite violent. Other works have included her staying for 12 days in a gallery and did not eat or sleep or have any privacy, but would just spend time in this room trying to change the atmosphere of the space. Or her work in Artist is Present, in which she would sit across from a viewer or a gallery. Oh my God, what is the word I want? A gallery viewer, a person who would come into the gallery to see the art. She would sit with them for 3 months, 8 hours a day, and spend time with 1,000 strangers, looking them in the eyes. And it was just about connection between the audience members and the artist. I have a video of this as well as the previous work from Sex and the City. The house with the ocean view, was featured on Sex and the City, which is really weird. You can definitely check it out. But the Artist is Present, Ule came back and she stared with him and they started crying. It was very sort of emotional as they sort of broke up like 10 or 20 years ago.
As a side note, Marina Abramovic today is contemplating and playing with this opera with Willem Dafoe, ironically enough. So she's done a lot of costuming with Burberry and other sort of companies to create this kind of aesthetically gorgeous opera. There's Willem Dafoe. So obviously, next week, as in right now, I'm going to put up the lectures for contemporary art.